Dubai 2017. A city that sells perfection in glass and gold. That night, the ballroom of one of its most exclusive hotels glowed like a palace out of legend. Chandeliers scattered light across tables draped in silk, while violins carried music over a sea of jeweled gowns and designer kanjuras. The whispers of 500 guests echoed the same sentiment. This was no ordinary wedding. It was a union between power and ambition, sealed with roses, gold, and promise. At the center stood the bride, radiant in crimson silk embroidered with real gold thread. Her wrists shimmered with bangles, her neck heavy with diamonds, each stone a promise of permanence. Beside her, the groom smiled the smile of a man born to wealth and expectation, his kanjura pressed to military precision. To any observer, they looked perfect. The picture of love, prosperity, and destiny fulfilled. But perfection has a way of cracking under its own weight. And in this ballroom, beneath the glitter of wealth and the performance of tradition, cracks had already begun to form. Guests whispered about the unusual match. A family of immense fortune and prestige accepting a bride from outside their elite circle. Some admired the boldness. Others smirked behind manicured hands. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion. What no one saw was the storm already building. A secret carried into the marriage like contraband. A past the bride thought she had buried. And a groom whose insecurities had been waiting for the perfect excuse to erupt. Hours later, the roses laid across their hotel suite would be crushed beneath violence. The silk of her bridal sari would be torn and stained. A single broken bangle would glint under the suite's cold light, its jagged edges sharper than any vow. And the woman who left the ballroom smiling as a new bride would be discovered lifeless on marble floors, her story rewritten from fairy tale to cautionary tale before the ink on her marriage certificate had dried. This is not just the story of a wedding night turned to horror. It is the story of how hidden pasts, family honor, and the fragile pride of men can transform paradise into prison. In the mid-2010s, Dubai stood as the world's monument to ambition. Glass towers rose from the desert like crystal spears, each one promising fortune to those daring enough to chase it. Fortune seekers arrived from every direction: South Asia, the Philippines, Africa, Europe, each carrying dreams as fragile as the visas in their passports. For the fortunate few, Dubai was paradise. For most, it was a stage where every movement was watched, judged, and ranked in an invisible hierarchy. At the top of this order were families whose names opened doors and closed mouths. Dynasties built from oil money and political ties maintained empires not just of wealth, but of reputation. In such circles, a marriage was never simply about love. It was a transaction, a merger, an agreement that preserved honor and extended legacy. A groom's lineage mattered as much as his fortune. A bride's purity was her only currency. Anything less invited scandal, and scandal was intolerable. Into this delicate balance entered the vast expatriate community. Nearly 90% of Dubai's population came from elsewhere, people who built the city's skyline, staffed its hotels, and managed its households. Some of these outsiders married into Emirati or wealthy South Asian families, rare unions that drew fascination and scrutiny in equal measure. To traditionalists, these matches blurred lines of blood and status. To others, they offered hope, proof that love could cross borders of class and culture. But love in Dubai carried rules that few dared to speak of. Behind the designer gowns and immaculate villas lay silence. Domestic violence, when it erupted in elite families, seldom reached headlines. Police were cautious, reports were muffled, and the law bent easily under pressure from powerful names. To question a man of influence was to risk exile. To expose a family's shame was to invite ruin. This was the Dubai into which the young bride stepped. A world where appearances mattered more than truth, where a secret past could become a death sentence, and where, beneath the golden lights of luxury, shadows stretched long and silent. Every tragedy begins with families who believed they were writing a different story. This one was no exception. On one side stood the groom's family, wealthy, established, and relentless in their pursuit of perfection. Their empire stretched across real estate, shipping, and luxury retail, businesses that had transformed them from regional merchants into a dynasty with international clout. Their name opened doors in government offices and closed mouths in courtrooms. Within their marble-walled compound, reputation was guarded like treasure, and purity of bloodline was a currency more valuable than oil. For generations, they had married within a narrow circle of equally powerful families, sealing alliances with gold, land, and political leverage. To them, marriage was not a matter of affection. It was continuity, a guarantee that their name would remain unblemished, their influence intact. The patriarch embodied this obsession. A man who believed image was destiny, he measured his son's worth not by accomplishments, but by his ability to preserve the family's legacy. To him, a bride was not a partner but a symbol, her beauty a reflection of status, her background a measure of family honor, her womb a vessel to carry the dynasty forward. When whispers of the groom's insecurities began to circulate, his temper, his fragile ego, his history of failed engagements, the family doubled down. A suitable marriage, they believed, would fix everything. On the other side stood the bride's family. Expatriates from India who had spent 2 decades in Dubai, they lived modestly in the shadow of skyscrapers their labor had helped build. Her father managed accounts at a mid-level trading firm. Her mother stitched garments from home to supplement the household income. Their dreams were simple: stability, dignity, and a better future for their children. For them, the wedding was more than a social contract. It was a miracle. Their daughter would cross the invisible barrier between expatriate struggle and elite privilege, stepping into a life they had never dared imagine. At the engagement, when gold necklaces were draped across her neck and guests toasted to her good fortune, her parents believed all sacrifices had been worth it. They could not have known that the very walls they celebrated inside would soon become her prison. That in marrying into power, their daughter was not securing her future, but stepping into its fatal undoing. To outsiders, the groom was the picture of success. Tall, broad-shouldered, his beard trimmed with the precision of a sculptor's hand. He dressed in designer kanjuras pressed to perfection, his wrist heavy with Swiss watches that gleamed beneath the lights of Dubai's most exclusive majlis. He moved through society's upper tiers with practiced ease, offering warm handshakes, polite laughter, and a confidence that seemed unshakable. To guests at weddings, to business associates at lavish dinners, he was a golden son, the heir to a dynasty, destined to expand the empire and carry the family name into the next generation. But perfection is often a costume, and beneath his polished exterior lived a man haunted by shadows he could not escape. From adolescence, he carried the burden of comparison. His father, a patriarch forged in the old ways, measured worth not in kindness or intellect, but in dominance, control, and the ability to command respect. By those standards, the son was always lacking. Behind closed doors, he was fragile, quick to anger, and unable to tolerate even imagined slights. Whispers followed him wherever he went. A broken engagement in London, an heiress who left suddenly, citing irreconcilable differences. Another in Abu Dhabi, dissolved quietly when the bride's family discovered rumors of his explosive temper. At least 3 prospective marriages had collapsed before this one. Each rejection left a scar, feeding paranoia that he was cursed, unworthy, or incapable of fulfilling his role as a husband and heir. There were darker whispers too, murmurs that cut deeper, trips to European fertility clinics, confidential consultations in Switzerland. Words like oligospermia floated through social circles, suggesting that his ability to produce heirs, the one duty demanded of him, was in question. In a culture where virility was tied to honor, these rumors became a private humiliation, and humiliation was something he could never forgive. Publicly, he countered with extravagance: luxury cars, penthouse parties, and an ever-growing wardrobe of designer clothes. He appeared at galas with confidence, laughing the loudest, tipping the most generously. But those who served him, the drivers, the staff, saw the cracks. They witnessed jealous rages over trivial matters, bursts of cruelty when he felt ignored, silence that stretched for days when he believed someone had disrespected him. To the world, he was a prince of Dubai's golden age. But in reality, he was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, his insecurities gnawing away at him, waiting for the smallest spark to send him into freefall. On his wedding night, that spark would arrive. If the groom carried the burden of privilege, the bride carried the weight of hope. She was born far from Dubai's golden towers, in a middle-class Indian family that valued education as the only ladder out of limitation. From childhood, she stood apart, curious, ambitious, the kind of student who borrowed extra books and stayed awake long after others slept. Teachers described her as determined, her parents as dutiful. She dreamed not of palaces or penthouses, but of a future where her hard work could build security for those she loved. When the family migrated to Dubai in the early 2000s, she found herself straddling two worlds. At school, she saw classmates ferried to class in luxury cars, their weekends spent in malls and yachts. At home, she shared a modest apartment with her parents and siblings, her evenings filled with chores and whispered prayers that her father's job would hold steady through each economic downturn. She studied accounting, took a secretarial course, and landed work in an office tower that overlooked the city she longed to belong to. But youth is rarely lived without mistakes. In her early 20s, she entered a relationship with a man she believed cared for her, a businessman, older, charismatic, generous in ways her modest upbringing had never prepared her for. For a time, she allowed herself to believe she had found both love and stability. But the relationship was a fragile illusion, built on secrecy and imbalance. When she discovered he was married, she ended it, ashamed and determined to bury the memory. She deleted photographs, erased messages, and told herself the past could be sealed away if she never spoke of it again. By the time marriage negotiations began with the wealthy groom's family, she had rebuilt her image carefully. She dressed modestly, spoke softly, presented herself as the perfect partner, educated, respectable, untainted by scandal. Her parents celebrated her good fortune, telling friends that their daughter was proof of how far hard work and faith could carry a family. For her, the wedding was more than a union, it was redemption. It was a chance to step into a world she had always admired from the outside, to rewrite her narrative as a dutiful wife, a devoted daughter, and eventually, a mother. But the past has a way of clawing back to the surface. What she thought was forgotten was not. In a city where whispers travel faster than light, where secrets are traded like currency, her history waited like a landmine beneath polished floors. And on her wedding night, it would detonate. The ballroom glittered like a palace of glass and gold. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with floral murals, their light scattering across 1,000 sequins stitched into gowns and sherwanis. A sea of 500 guests filled the vast space, the air thick with the perfume of roses imported from Kashmir and lilies flown in from Holland. On one side, an orchestra played softly. On the other, photographers jostled to capture every moment of a wedding that had already become the city's most discussed event of the season. The groom made his entrance first. Draped in a designer sherwani embroidered with threads of real gold, he walked with the assured grace of a man who knew the room was his. His family followed close behind, their jewels catching the light, their presence a reminder of their wealth and stature. Applause rippled through the crowd as if royalty had arrived. Then came the bride. Dressed in crimson silk heavy with jewels, her veil shimmered as it trailed behind her like liquid fire. The diamonds at her neck reflected flashes from the cameras, while her bangles chimed like fragile bells with each step. She walked slowly, her face composed, her eyes lowered in practiced modesty. To the untrained eye, she was radiant. To those who knew her, there was something else, an anxious glimmer, a flicker of doubt buried beneath the powder and kohl. The guests whispered. They always did. Some remarked on her beauty, her elegance, her poise. Others whispered about the unusual match, an outsider, not from one of Dubai's ruling families, marrying into a dynasty that had always guarded its bloodline with vigilance. "She's lucky," some murmured with envy. "She doesn't belong," others said with suspicion. Every word was a reminder that this marriage was as much performance as it was union. The rituals unfolded in perfect sequence, rings exchanged, vows spoken, blessings given. Cameras clicked, music swelled, and champagne flutes sparkled under the chandeliers. It was, by every appearance, a flawless ceremony. Yet as the couple smiled for photographs, the cracks beneath the surface widened. The groom's jaw tightened whenever whispers reached his ears. The bride's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her veil. To the world, this was a fairy-tale wedding. But fairy-tales rarely survive the weight of reality. And in just a few hours, the roses decorating their hotel suite would be crushed, her bangles shattered, and the crimson silk she wore with such pride would be torn and stained forever. The hotel suite reserved for the couple was nothing short of a palace. Situated on the 45th floor of a five-star tower in downtown Dubai, it overlooked the dancing fountains and the glittering skyline. Inside, roses had been scattered across silk sheets, and champagne chilled in a crystal bucket beside chocolate-dipped strawberries. To the staff who prepared it, this was romance perfected. To the bride who entered that night, it would become a chamber of terror. When the heavy wooden doors closed behind them, the applause and music of the wedding faded into silence. For the first time since the ceremony, they were alone. The groom's smile vanished almost immediately. His eyes, sharp and searching, lingered on her face longer than before. The bride, still in her crimson silk and jewels, felt the sudden shift in air, the transformation of the man she had married. At first, his question seemed harmless. "How many men looked at you tonight?" he asked, his tone too casual to mask the suspicion. She tried to laugh it off, adjusting her veil, insisting that guests had merely admired the wedding spectacle. But his eyes hardened. He moved closer, his voice lower now, demanding details about her past. "Tell me who you were before me. Tell me everything. I deserve to know." The bride froze. For months, she had carefully guarded her history, shaping her identity into what would be acceptable for his family. There were things she feared would ruin everything, relationships she thought buried, choices made in desperation before she had climbed into Dubai's glittering social ladder. But now, under the gaze of the man who had promised her forever, she realized the mask she wore was crumbling. When her answers didn't satisfy, his voice rose. He accused her of deception, of dishonoring him on their wedding night. "Do you think you can fool me?" he hissed. The champagne bottle tipped, spilling across the marble floor. The roses on the bed were crushed beneath his fists as he pounded the mattress in fury. What began as interrogation quickly escalated into violence. He tore the bangles from her wrists, the glass cutting into her skin. Her cries echoed against the suite's gilded walls, but no one came. In luxury hotels, privacy is sacred. No staff would dare interrupt a newlywed couple, no matter what sounds carried through the doors. Hours passed in a blur of rage and terror. Every promise of love, every public display of devotion, dissolved into a storm of fists, accusations, and humiliation. The crimson silk of her bridal attire was ripped apart, its vibrant color now indistinguishable from the blood on her skin. By dawn, the suite looked less like a honeymoon sanctuary and more like a battlefield. Shattered glass glistened on the carpet. The roses had withered into a dark, trampled mess. The bride lay motionless, her body broken by the man who only hours earlier had slipped a diamond ring onto her finger. To the world outside, the fountains continued to dance, the towers sparkled, and Dubai's skyline glowed with the illusion of perfection. But inside that suite, a young bride's dream had ended in horror, her wedding night transformed into her death sentence. The morning after the wedding, the Burj Khalifa district awoke in its usual rhythm of luxury. Chauffeurs polished black sedans, guests streamed into designer boutiques, and breakfast terraces filled with chatter in a dozen languages. To the outside world, it was just another glittering dawn in Dubai. Inside the hotel, however, a nightmare was about to unfold. At 7:15 a.m., housekeeping knocked politely on the suite's heavy wooden doors. There was no response. The staff member accustomed to latrizing newlyweds hesitated before quietly returning an hour later. Again, silence. By 9:00 a.m., the head of housekeeping, worried about strict check protocols, used a master key. What awaited them inside was a scene no one could have imagined. The room smelled faintly of spilt champagne and iron, the metallic tang of blood. The roses that had decorated the suite were crushed and strewn across the carpet like remnants of a battle. Glass from shattered champagne, flutes sparkled in the morning light. And in the center of it all, on the bed where she should have woken to a new life, lay the young bride. Her crimson silk dress was torn, her jewelry scattered across the floor. Bruises darkened her wrists and arms, and her face bore the unmistakable marks of violence. Her body, motionless and battered, told the truth her lips would never speak. The groom sat slumped in a corner chair, his head in his hands, his white kandjura stained with streaks of blood. His breathing was shallow, his eyes vacant, neither fully present nor entirely absent. To the stunned staff, he muttered only fragments. "She lied, she deceived me, I had no choice." Hotel security was called immediately. Within minutes, the polished hallways were buzzing with discreet chaos. The management faced an impossible balance: contain the scandal while following protocol. Police were contacted, but so too were private fixers loyal to the groom's powerful family. Within the hour, the once open crime scene began to close in on itself, wrapped in secrecy. The first police officers who entered the room recognized signs that contradicted an accident. Defensive wounds on the bride's arms suggested she had fought for her life. Blood spatter on the walls spoke of repeated blows, not a single tragic fall. Yet even as these details were quietly noted, the presence of men in tailored suits, crisis managers hired by the family, shifted the investigation's tone. The official narrative began to form almost instantly. A tragic accident during the wedding night, they said. An emotional argument that led to unintended consequences. Phrases were carefully chosen, each word designed to soften brutality into misfortune. By noon, whispers rippled through the hotel staff. Some claimed the bride had collapsed from exhaustion. Others spoke in hushed tones about screams they thought they had heard in the early hours. None dared to speak publicly. In Dubai, where power flows through invisible channels, silence can mean survival. The bride's body was quietly removed through a service elevator, concealed from guests enjoying their morning lattes and fountain views. Her family, thousands of miles away, would receive only the sanitized version, a sudden, tragic accident in paradise. But among the staff who had seen the room, who had witnessed the broken glass and crushed roses, there was no doubt. This was not an accident. It was the violent end of a young woman's dream, erased by the man she had trusted most, and buried beneath the weight of wealth and reputation. News of the bride's death spread through Dubai's elite circles faster than any official statement could contain it. By the time her body was discreetly flown back to her homeland, the city's glittering corridors of power were already buzzing with rumors. For the Al-Manssuri family, one of Dubai's most prominent dynasties, the tragedy was not just personal, it was existential. Behind the high walls of their palatial compound, the patriarch Salem Al-Manssuri convened an emergency family council. His face, once known for its charming smile and signature gold Rolex, was ashen with rage and humiliation. He had spent decades cultivating an empire of wealth and respectability, carefully balancing business ventures with political connections. Now, in a single night, his son's brutality threatened to undo it all. The elders debated strategy. Should they present the groom as a grieving husband whose young wife had tragically collapsed? Or should they acknowledge marital conflict but emphasize it as a one-time outburst? The truth, that the heir had beaten his bride to death after discovering her past, was unthinkable. In a culture where honor defines legacy, shame was more dangerous than crime. The bride's family, thousands of miles away, received a carefully sanitized explanation. Representatives from the family's legal team arrived at their modest home bearing condolences and an envelope heavy with cash. It was an unfortunate accident, they said. She slipped, she fell, she could not be saved. The money was presented as compassion, but its real purpose was silence. Back in Dubai, whispers grew sharper. In coffee shops and majlis gatherings, the story twisted into a cautionary tale. Some said the bride had deceived her husband about her past, and his rage was inevitable. Others blamed the groom, whispering that his instability had long been known but ignored. Every version of the story revealed more about the city's obsession with appearances than about the truth itself. Among the elite, invitations to the family's events quietly disappeared. Joint ventures were postponed indefinitely. The Al-Manssuri name, once synonymous with gold towers and endless influence, now carried the metallic taste of scandal. For women in the community, the story struck a different chord. In hushed living rooms, mothers warned their daughters, "Secrets always come out. Be careful what you hide." For domestic workers and expatriates, it was a chilling reminder of how powerless women could be in palaces where reputations outweighed justice. Meanwhile, the groom himself was whisked out of Dubai within days. Officially, he was sent abroad for psychiatric treatment following the trauma of his wife's sudden passing. Unofficially, it was exile cloaked in medical necessity, a way to shield him from police questioning, from media scrutiny, and from the haunting scene of his crime. The state's involvement was equally delicate. To preserve Dubai's image as a global city of luxury and security, the case was quickly closed. The official report spoke of domestic complications and a tragic accident during a private moment. No charges, no trial, no scandal. Just another closed file in a city built on spotless glass facades. But outside official channels, the bride's story refused to vanish. Filipino and South Asian domestic worker networks whispered the details, about the screams that echoed from the suite, about the bruises that told their own story, about the silence that followed. For them, it became a symbol, proof that even in the most glamorous towers, women like her could be discarded, their stories rewritten by those with power. Within the Al-Manssuri compound, the fallout was more intimate. Salem, once the unshakable patriarch, began drinking heavily. His wife, Sema, retreated from public life entirely. And Ferris, the groom-turned-killer, became a ghost within his own family's legacy, his name spoken only in whispers, his image scrubbed from family portraits and business websites. In the end, the cultural fallout was not measured in police files or courtrooms, but in silence. The silence of a family desperate to preserve its name, the silence of a city that prized reputation over truth, and the silence of a young woman whose voice was extinguished before she ever had a chance to be heard. In Dubai, scandals are not erased by truth. They are erased by money, connections, and the machinery of power. From the moment hotel security radioed the first report, the Al-Manssuri family had mobilized its crisis apparatus. What unfolded over the next 72 hours was not an investigation into a crime, but a masterclass in controlled erasure. By dawn, the suite where the bride had been killed was no longer a honeymoon chamber, but a sealed-off operation site. The family's lawyers arrived before police could complete their inspection. Alongside them came a crisis management team flown in overnight from London. Men and women in tailored suits whose specialty was burying disasters that threatened billion-dollar reputations. The first step was language. Words became weapons, sharpened for narrative control. Beaten was replaced with injured. Murder became accident. Domestic violence softened into marital complications. In press drafts, the bride was portrayed as fragile, emotionally overwhelmed by the pressures of a new marriage. The groom, meanwhile, was cast as heartbroken, too distraught to speak. Every phrase blurred the brutality into ambiguity. The second step was evidence. The hotel's security cameras, which might have captured fragments of the night's horrors, were mysteriously corrupted. Technical glitch, the IT department claimed, though insiders whispered of external consultants who had wiped the drives clean. Blood on the marble floor was scrubbed away by forensic cleaners brought in under the guise of maintenance. The roses, the broken glass, the torn fabric, every trace of violence was collected in black bags and incinerated before sunrise. The autopsy posed a more delicate problem. Dr. Hassan, the city's chief medical examiner, initially documented injuries consistent with sustained assault, multiple contusions, defensive wounds on the arms, fractured ribs. But before her report reached official files, she was invited to a private meeting with senior officials. Within 24 hours, her findings had been revised. The final document cited head trauma consistent with a fall, accompanied by vague references to stress-related complications. For her cooperation, Dr. Hassan received an expedited promotion to a prestigious administrative post, far from morgues and messy truths. Police detectives, too, found themselves steered. Captain called Al-Zara, a seasoned investigator, recognized immediately that the injuries told a story very different from the family's account. But when he pressed for further interviews with the groom, his superiors intervened. "National interest," they said. "We must protect stability." His case file was stamped closed before he could file a single dissenting note. The bride's body, which should have been held for further forensic review, was quietly released to the family within 48 hours. Her remains, sealed in a polished coffin, were flown home on a private jet. Her grieving parents were handed a tightly written statement. Their daughter had died in a tragic domestic accident. Along with the statement came a check large enough to rebuild their home, fund her siblings' education, and guarantee lifelong financial security, so long as they accepted silence. Meanwhile, Dubai's media received carefully tailored press releases. State newspapers printed sympathetic stories of a young bride's tragic passing. Independent journalists who probed deeper quickly discovered the limits of curiosity in a city where censorship is both official and implied. One reporter who attempted to interview hotel staff was abruptly reassigned abroad. Another who reached out to the bride's relatives found his work visa revoked within weeks. On social media, however, whispers persisted. Anonymous posts claimed hotel employees had heard screams. Others insisted photographs existed of the aftermath. Each time such rumors gained traction, they were swiftly scrubbed, accounts suspended, posts deleted, hashtags shadowbanned. For every piece of speculation that surfaced, a dozen counter-narratives appeared, blaming stress, exhaustion, even supernatural curses. Confusion became another tool of erasure. The final step was the groom himself. Officially, he was too traumatized to face public life. Within days, he was transported by private jet to a Swiss psychiatric facility, where family lawyers ensured his records would remain sealed. Photographs of him vanished from society pages. His name was quietly omitted from new business documents. To the world, he simply disappeared, as though grief had swallowed him whole. What remained was a vacuum filled with an official story so carefully constructed it resembled truth. A bride had died tragically on her wedding night. Her husband was shattered. The family mourned privately. Case closed. But beneath the surface, those who had seen the suite, who had read the original autopsy, who had watched powerful men in tailored suits rewrite reality, knew the truth. This was no accident. This was a killing sanitized into silence, a cover-up polished until it gleamed like the towers that defined Dubai's skyline. For a while, the Al-Manssuri family believed their machinery of silence had succeeded. The newspapers had printed their version, the police file was closed, and the bride's body had been sent home under a veil of tragic ambiguity. But in Dubai, where wealth and image are everything, whispers have a way of slipping through even the tightest seals. The first cracks appeared among the hotel staff. Though sworn to confidentiality, they carried images in their minds too disturbing to bury. A housekeeper spoke in confidence to a cousin. It wasn't an accident. The room looked like a war zone. A bellboy told a friend about screams he thought he heard around 3 a.m., though he had convinced himself at the time it was just a movie playing. Within weeks, these fragments of testimony spread quietly through WhatsApp groups, each retelling twisting details but always circling back to the same truth. The bride had been beaten to death. From there, the gossip seeped into Dubai's elite social circles. At Majlis gatherings, men leaned close, lowering their voices to share what they'd heard. Some claimed the bride's past had shamed the groom. Others whispered about the father's affairs, hinting at a curse that had finally consumed the dynasty. Each story was more scandalous than the last, but what mattered was not the accuracy, it was the persistence. For the first time, the Al-Manssuri name no longer commanded respect but suspicion. Expatriate communities carried the story further. Filipino domestic workers, connected through vast informal networks, passed along what they knew or thought they knew. One message, supposedly from a nurse who had seen the bride's body, described bruises on every part of her arms, her face swollen. Another voice note circulated in Tagalog, claiming she had been pregnant and killed to hide it. These accounts, unverifiable but potent, spread faster than the family's carefully polished narrative. The family's attempts at control only made matters worse. When hotel employees who had spoken too freely were suddenly reassigned or sent home, it only confirmed suspicions. When a blogger posting about the Dubai bride murder had her account mysteriously suspended, it fueled the sense of cover-up. Silence, once the family's weapon, was beginning to sound like guilt. Even within official channels, unease grew. Captain called Al-Manssuri, the detective forced to close the case, confided privately to colleagues. "This was no accident. The file was stolen from me." Though he dared not speak publicly, his words added weight to the rumor mill. And Dr. Hassan, the medical examiner who had been promoted away from casework, found herself haunted by the photographs she had seen, injuries that no fall could explain. She carried that truth silently, her conscience heavy even as her career flourished. By the end of the year, whispers had hardened into a collective belief. The bride had been murdered and the family had buried it. At high society weddings, guests whispered about the cursed suite. At salons and shisha cafes, women warned each other about the dangers of marrying into families that valued honor above love. The city's glittering facade remained, but beneath it, the story had become folklore, a secret everyone knew but no one dared to say aloud. Internationally, too, the cracks widened. Filipino newspapers, initially cautious, began running speculative pieces citing anonymous sources. Human rights groups, already critical of domestic worker abuse in the Gulf, seized on the whispers as proof of systemic impunity. They could not name the Al-Manssuri family directly, but their reports dripped with implication. The dynasty fought back with silence. Salem withdrew from public appearances. The family foundation canceled events. The skyscraper that bore their name gleamed as always, but its offices were emptier. Partners began to pull away, not because they knew the truth, but because they feared the stink of scandal. In business, perception is everything, and the perception was now poisoned. The cover-up had been thorough, but it had missed one fatal detail. People remember stories more vividly than statements. And the story of a bride beaten to death on her wedding night, her roses crushed, her jewelry scattered, her husband crouched in silence, was too vivid to be erased. The facade of perfection was cracking, and through those cracks, the truth was beginning to seep.